You know, I get letters every day that I never got before. And those letters are from kids around the world and also from people in small towns who tell me, and I'm just so happy I saw this, or I saw The Unbelievers, or I read your book, because I realized I'm not a bad person for asking these questions. I'm not evil. And that is, to me, something I really hadn't appreciated before. That religion has usurped this notion of morality. So that if you just saying, you know, I don't buy it, automatically is equivalent to the saying, I'm not a good person. And that, to me, is the underlying, most immoral aspect of religion. It tries to have a monopoly on morality and ethics. What it does is it makes people feel guilty for thinking for themselves. And I can attest to that from just the vast and every single day. I'm amazed at that. And I hadn't appreciated that as an evil before I actually started getting labeled and then people wrote to me. So they did a further study and they questioned people who claimed the Christian box. They said, do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in transubstantiation? Do you believe in this? No, 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 no. Why do you call yourself Christian? Because I like to think of myself as a good person. And I think most people call themselves Christians because they think if they don't, they'll be labeled as bad people.
When Richard Dawkins says after the Paris attacks that women in headscarves should take them off in solidarity with the victims of the terrorist attack, is that fair? That seems like you're holding all Muslim women around the world responsible for terrorism.
Trying to provoke people to think about what's the point of headscarves.
Do you support such provocations?
I think provoking every now and then is fine. In fact, I would say, and this offends Muslims, that the main point is that Islam isn't any more stupid than Christianity or Judaism. They're all ridiculous.
But do you think you can build alliances with people when you tell them they're stupid, they're foolish, they're silly, they believe in a creep as a god, etc., etc., etc.? Is that possible?
No, you can't build alliances. But there's some groups you'll never build alliances with, and I think
1.2 billion people.
No, but I'm not talking about those groups. I'm talking about Islamic fundamentalists, who, in fact, I argued, are in some sense more of a danger. The biggest threat of Islamic fundamentalist terrorism is to Muslims.
I agree with you, which is why you probably shouldn't dismiss the entire faith and the entire community.
I don't think I have.
I think you've compared the God of Islam and Christianity to Saddam Hussein. That's not really a way of winning people over.
Well, I think all those gods are, well, no, but I think one has to, look, sometimes you have to get people to ask the question, what's the basis of their beliefs? Why are they doing it?
John Gray, the British philosopher, thinker, atheist, he says that a lot of people like you or Dawkins or others are campaigning atheists. They're missionaries. Would you accept that label, that you're a missionary for atheism?
I'm an evangelical for science. I'm pro understanding the real world and not letting myth and superstition build hatreds and separations between people. And that's my main interest. I'm much more interested in promoting science than I am destroying religion. You have this guy. Yeah, you do. Temporarily. Yeah, well, 9.5 years, ladies and gentlemen, 9.5 years you put up with him. And he is, as you know, silent scientist, government scientist talking about things like climate change, because he comes from Alberta. And whenever we allow that, whenever we allow that kind of censorship, that kind of open restrictions on questioning and pointing out inconvenient truths, then we have a problem. There's a connection between, in free societies, being afraid to offend people for ridiculous religious ideas and the right of people in other authoritarian societies to kill people because of them. It's a slippery slope. When we accept nonsense with any sort of impunity in our society, we do it a disservice to ourselves and, most importantly, to our children. If science has done anything, it's to liberate humanity from the shackles of superstition and enforced ignorance. It's happening again. It's not militant to celebrate this openly, to combat a conspiracy of silence and acquiescence, to make questioning everything so normal and so accepted that young people will not feel guilty for doing that, that TV hosts will not have news stories when someone does it, will not accept governments, totalitarian, theocratic, or democratic, that endorse, encourage, or enforce, or otherwise legitimize the suppression of free thought. We owe it to our children, not just here, but around the world. We owe it to the media to point out that self-censorship destroys a free press, the basis of a modern democracy. We owe it to all people around the world. And scientists have an obligation to be a part of that. There's beauty in the paintings that Leonardo da Vinci and others and Michelangelo and others did in the context of religion, but that's just the response to the culture of the time. And I don't see why, given what you know now, you can't have that same wisdom without discarding the provincial basis of it, which was based, let's face it, on the imaginings of illiterate peasants, Bronze Age peasants, before we knew the Earth even orbited the sun.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think Einstein actually analyzed it that way too, and the primitive origins of religion, although he did not believe in a personal God, and his statement about God, statement about God playing dice had nothing to do with God, and Niels Bohr came back and said, who is Einstein to tell God what to do? But he did, at the end of his life, become very appreciative of Judaism. He said, Judaism is about life as we live it and can know it. That aspect of religion. But okay.
Yeah, no, and so if you accept it as a philosophy, it's fine up to a point, although actually, I have grave problems with it as a philosophy as well. But, there's wisdom in all the writings that humans have come up with at some level, and we should appreciate that wisdom. And I don't mean to suggest we shouldn't open our minds to trying to see those reflections and the potential wisdom, but I guess, as Einstein would have said, I don't see the underpinnings. And he would have, as a cultural thing, he would have said, well, it's important to preserve that culture. And I guess I believe strongly in preserving culture, but culture that's based on productive reality. I personally think that every single thing that religion provides, rationality, empiricism, and science can provide, and not only that, it can provide it better.
As Carl Sagan said, if we're alone, it's an awful waste of space. But at some point, the question comes down to an interesting question of how rare is intelligence? I mean, it could be, and I happen to believe that since all the conditions for life exist elsewhere in the galaxy, water, organic materials, light, all of that life is ubiquitous. But I'm willing to believe that even if it's really rare, there's still a lot of intelligent life in the galaxy.
Where are the aliens?
Okay. Well, we live in a random corner in the far edge of the Milky Way galaxy. Fermi's paradox is that, well, look, if life evolved, it would basically colonize the galaxy, and you could calculate it would send out robots or parts of its civilization to 4 other planets that would then send to 4 other planets. And everything would grow exponentially. It's not a bad logic, but I don't think it's inevitable. It's just as plausible to me that civilizations will exist where they are until they exhaust all the resources where they are, and then they'll move on. At the same time, as Fermi's paradox is certainly not illogical, but not necessary. Even if life is very rare, in an absolute sense, it can nevertheless be very abundant. It may sound ridiculous, but that's possible in the universe. I mean, it's a long shot that even if there's life out there, we'll ever know about it. That's the sad thing. But I also, at the same time, believe it's out there, and that's good enough for me.
Science has taught us that the world we think exists is not necessarily the way the world is. And we cannot have a consistent sense of reality without being willing to force our beliefs to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around. When we look out at societies that deny, that we think are backwards, and I'll pick one as fundamentalist Islam, we look at people who have denied the reality of the world around them. They have turned their backs on science, and we view them as uncivilized, and they've turned their backs on science, and part of the reason that the problems is because by turning their backs on science, they've departed from the modern world and don't have the benefits of modern technology. If we're going to have a consistent understanding of how we're supposed to behave, we have to understand that the world is different than our intuition necessarily projects, and science has been the only way to learn about that. We don't have absolute truths in science, unlike religion. That's the reason that science makes progress, because we can change our minds. And I think that's a really important thing, that we, as I often say, if you're a theoretical physicist, the 2 most important states to be in are either wrong or confused. Because that means there's a lot left to learn. It's hard to imagine. I mean, given that there are over 100 billion stars in our galaxy, we now have learned that most of those stars have planets around them, so solar systems. 100 billion galaxies, with all those stars and galaxies, and we also know that there's lots of water out there, organic molecules, and sunlight, which is all that was necessary for life to evolve here on Earth. So it's Hard to imagine it hasn't evolved somewhere else. I find it amazing that here we are on this random planet, in this random place in the middle of nowhere, and we have, through our minds and the fact that we're graced with consciousness, been able to understand the universe to the earliest moments of the Big Bang. I think it's worth celebrating. These are ideas that are fascinating. Part of the benefit of science, we always talk about technology, and of course science is responsible for everything in this room almost. But for me, science is as important for its ideas and its impact on our culture. It's like great art and literature and music. It's what makes being humans worth being human. The question is religion important? Because that's an obvious thing. Religion is obviously important. So are nuclear weapons. The question is religion outmoded, and are nuclear weapons outmoded? And will the world be a better place without them? And the answer, both those, is yes. Okay, religion is very important, nuclear weapons are very important, but neither of them in the modern world serve a productive purpose. And so I think that I accept and don't need to debate the question of whether religion is an important part of the way the world is run. The question is, should it be, should it continue to be, and is it decreasing? And in fact, what also hasn't been pointed out is that in most places, in fact happily, monotonically in the first world, the people identifying themselves as religious is decreasing year by year. The first year in England, by the way, as you know from a recent poll, more than half the population finally acknowledged that they didn't have any religious affiliation. In the United States even, it's been decreasing in spite of the efficiency of competition. So
here's an idea of why common sense should tell you that Islam, like many other religions, is not common sense. Because, of course, homosexuality is perfectly natural. In all animal species, almost, it's natural. It occurs with a 10% frequency. Okay? In fact, there are good evolutionary reasons for homosexuality. So in that sense, there's no reason and a fundamental... Why would a God who thought it was a sin make it natural among all species? I don't think the sheep, by the way, which 10% of sheep are long-term homosexual relationships. Okay? Why would a God who thought it was a sin create sheep who aren't able to think about it be homosexual? That's the kind of nonsense that we have to ask, and the only way we can determine if it's nonsense is by looking at the world around us, not by deducing it, not by listening to the words of ignorant individuals and Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. Wisdom and learning comes from observing the world around us, and we shouldn't take our wisdom from people who didn't even understand the way the world worked. My intent, and I'm sure I've offended people here, my intent was not to offend. I always offend, and I offend some of my scientific colleagues too. My intent was just to raise questions and encourage people to think about issues. And for that, I hope that some of the statements I've made will cause people to think. And indeed, my whole point is that given access to information, and I believe you should get access to information about the world really works, which is why I write scientific books and I speak, because I think these are some of those beautiful ideas people have ever come up with, that we shouldn't be afraid of them. We shouldn't fear them. We shouldn't view them as if, in fact, if they offend our beliefs, that's a good thing, because it means our beliefs are wrong. And that, as I say to students all the time, is the greatest gift we can have. Changing our minds and learning is what's produced the progress that allows this room to happen, that allows these video cameras to be recording things. So I just hope that as I hope I am willing to change my beliefs or change my mind in the presence of evidence and get information, that I hope that some of the things I've said have spurred your thinking, and I certainly don't want to convert you into anything. And so thank you for listening. If you spank the vacuum hard enough, you'll actually kick out real particles. And those particles are called Higgs particles. So for 50 years we said, we want to build a machine that will spank empty space hard enough, where we take enough energy from and put it in a small enough region that maybe we can excite real particles, and if that Higgs field really exists, then those particles should exist. And as you know, on July 4th, 2012, we discovered the Higgs particles. We discovered we live in this world that's an illusion. That the only reason you and I exist are because of it. Because once the Higgs field gets mass, it turns out, once the particles that convey the weak force get mass, so do many of the particles that make you and I up. We think much of the mass of all elementary particles is due to interacting with that Bose condensate that exists throughout all of empty space. If it wasn't there, all the particles that make us up would be massless.
Our existence is an accident. We are like those that live on that icicle. The world that we live in which we exist in, the world that some people claim was created for us, is just an accident and an illusion. In the underlying reality, all the particles that make us up are massless, the particles that convey the weak force are massless, and it's all there just because the universe happened to freeze in a certain random direction and cause that Higgs field to form, just like in certain materials, and only certain materials, if they get cold enough, it'll freeze and form a Bose-Einstein condensate. And those other materials are not superconducting. If the universe hadn't frozen randomly in that specific direction, just like that icicle, we wouldn't be here. So much for a universe created for us. It's just an accident like living on an icicle. And just like those people who live on an icicle, if they did, would create a theology explaining why it was so beautiful and purposeful that the universe was created so that they could exist, they wouldn't know that in another icicle, somewhere else, the other direction would be pointing, and would be specially favored, and their universe would be very different. It's a cosmic accident. I'm in Canada, I had to show beer bottles, but if it's just like what happens, our universe, it turns out, is just like we think what happens if you have a party, a beer party, which all Canadians have and will have later maybe. But if you're like me, you forget to put the beer bottles in the fridge before the party, so what you do is you put them in the freezer, and then you forget, and then the next day you open one up and it cracks, because under high pressure, the liquid is a liquid, but the minute you remove the pressure, the preferred ground state, the beer suddenly freezes, the water and liquid expands, breaks the bottle, and that's what we think happened in our universe. In fact, it describes very well the history of the early universe, which led to the existence of a Higgs particle and the Higgs field. It's just like a beer party. Our universe is just like a beer party when you left the bottles in.